She was 26 and newly widowed, and the law had already decided what she was worth. Not nothing. They were careful about that. The Hargrove family had solicitors who understood the difference between cruelty and exposure, and so Agnes Hargrove, née Parish, was not turned out into the road. She was given instead the Gatehouse. It stood at the foot of the estate drive, 100 yards below the main house, separated from it by a long avenue of copper beeches that in autumn turned the color of old blood. 2 stories of Pennine limestone, unlived in since the previous century. The east chimney leaned away from the gable at an angle that suggested it was considering the matter carefully. Inside, a parlor the size of a ship's cabin, a rusted kitchen range, 1 bedroom above, and a staircase whose 4th step had rotted through entirely. This was her inheritance. This was what remained of 11 years of marriage, of a household run with the kind of quiet, invisible competence that is noticed only when it stops. Colonel Edmund Hargrove had not been a bad man. He had been a weak one, which in certain families amounts to the same thing. He had always meant to revise his will. His solicitor had been sent for. There had been papers on the desk. And then there had been a morning in March when Agnes came in with his tea and found the cup unnecessary, and the papers still unsigned. The will that stood was 20 years old. It left everything, the house, the farms, the timber, the rents, to his brother, Captain Gerald Hargrove, whose disposition toward his sister-in-law had never warmed past the temperature of polite acknowledgement. Agnes had been born Agnes Parish, daughter of a land agent in the West Riding, a man who kept accounts with the precision of a clockmaker and raised his daughters to read a contract before they signed it. She had read everything in the Hargrove household, the marriage settlement, the ledgers, the estate accounts she was never formally asked to manage, but had managed anyway for 7 years, because Edmund found numbers fatiguing and Agnes found them clarifying. She knew what the estate was worth. She knew she would leave with none of it. What she carried out of Hargrove Hall on the 12th of April, 1868, 2 trunks of clothing, a rosewood writing case that had been her mother's, the household receipt book in her own hand, a miniature of Edmund in a morocco case, and £14, 3 shillings. Captain Gerald had been civil about it. His wife Harriet had been rather less so, confining her unkindness to tone. The particular quality of concern with which she asked whether Agnes was quite certain she could manage the Gatehouse on her own, positioning the word manage to contain within it everything it needed to contain. Agnes said she was quite certain. She thanked them for their generosity, and she walked down the avenue of copper beeches without looking back. She stood before the Gatehouse in the April wind and looked at it. A robin was singing from the rowan tree beside the gate. The Gatehouse looked back at her with its blind, grimy windows and its leaning chimney, and Agnes thought, I have repaired worse than this. She had. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. The door opened with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the building's memory. The parlor was small, low-ceilinged, smelling of cold ash and the particular sweetness that old stone develops when sealed too long, not quite damp, but the memory of it. Light came through 2 windows, so filmed with algae they rendered the valley in shades of grey-green, like looking through river water. A date was cast into the iron fireback, 1703, in numerals gone orange with rust. The kitchen was worse. The range was solid ironwork beneath its rust, but a jackdaw family had colonized the flue, and their nest had fallen into the firebox. The stone sink was intact, and beside it a hand pump that, after considerable protest, delivered brown water that eventually ran clear. She noted the pump. A woman who had water had the beginning of everything. She climbed the staircase carefully, stepping over the rotted 4th tread. The bedroom above held a plain iron bedstead, a cracked washstand basin, and board floors. She walked plank by plank, listening for rot. 2 boards near the window would need replacing. The rest held. She stood at the window facing the valley. Below, the drive curved toward the road. Beyond it, the land fell toward the river, a pale gleam in the April afternoon. She could see Threshwick's church tower and mill. It was a view she had looked at for 11 years from the hall's drawing room, and she was surprised to find she preferred it from here. The hall's view had been the view of a house that thought it owned the landscape. This was the view of a house that lived inside it. The first week was labor. She cleared the jackdaw nest from the flue in 3 sessions of work that left her black with soot. She rebuilt the damper from a piece of sheet tin bent over a log. On the 4th day, she lit the range and it drew. The pump's leather washer she replaced with a disc cut from a split boot. The 4th tread she repaired with oak from a fallen hedgerow timber pegged tight. By the end of the 2nd week, the gatehouse was habitable. Cold, in the way stone holds winter inside for safekeeping, but the range burned, and the pump worked, and the stairs were navigable. She had spent almost nothing. The £14 were nearly intact. On the 2nd Sunday evening, she opened the writing case and took out the one document she had carried from the hall that was not correspondence, a copy she had made herself, in the evenings while Edmund slept, of the deed by which the gatehouse had been conveyed to the estate in 1791. She had copied it because her father had taught her to read documents, and she had read this one and found something that nagged at her like a word she could not quite remember. She smoothed it on the writing case lid and read it again by lamplight. The conveyancing language was dense and circular, transferring the gatehouse from one Josiah Thorpe to one Henry Hargrove in 1791. Standard enough, but in a subordinate clause, buried in the middle of a long sentence about rights of way, there was a description of what was excluded from the transfer. And then, a phrase Agnes had copied 4 times because she could not quite believe she had read it correctly. Subject to a separate instrument of conveyance, not herein contained. There was another document. There had always been another document. She folded the copy and returned it to the writing case. She sat with the lamp burning and the range ticking as it cooled, and she thought about the 4th step, and the pump, and all the things a building will surrender to someone patient enough to ask. Then she thought about the root cellar. She had noticed it in the first week without giving it the weight it deserved. Behind the kitchen, a second door set into the exterior wall opened onto stone steps descending into darkness. She had held her lamp over the opening, seen what appeared to be a root cellar, shelves, barrels, the smell of cold earth, and noted it as a useful space that could wait. She returned to it in the 3rd week. At first assessment, it was exactly what it appeared to be. 12 feet by 8. Stone walls, a vaulted brick ceiling, oak shelving on 2 walls, still sound, empty barrels, their hoops rusted, their staves gapped, stone flags in a lime mortar that had in places crumbled to powder. She was turning to go back up the steps when the lamplight caught something she had taken for a shadow. It was not a shadow. It was a seam. Running across the floor, parallel to the far wall and perhaps 3 feet before it, was a line too straight to be a joint between flags. It ran wall to wall, then turned at right angles at each end, forming 3 sides of a rectangle, roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet long. Agnes set the lamp on the step and crouched beside the seam. The material filling it was not mortar, smoother, denser, with a faint waxy quality. She fetched the iron rod from the outbuilding and pressed it into the corner. The material resisted, then gave a gap, and she felt, quite distinctly, a movement, not in the rod, but in the stone itself. She stood and looked at the rectangle of floor for a long time. Then she went upstairs and made tea and read the deed clause again. She worked on the seam for 3 days. The compound, not mortar but something poured rather than troweled, came away in fragments, leaving the flag edges clean and sharp, cut by a craftsman who cared about the fit. On the 4th day she found the iron ring, countersunk flush into the central flag, so precisely she had run her finger over it twice without registering it. She worked the compound from its edges, a ring of wrought iron, 4 inches across, on a pivot in a recess. She oiled the pivot with lamp oil and turned the ring and pulled upward. The flag rose on a central pivot, counterweighted below, and swung to rest against the wall. Beneath it, cut through the bedrock, a shaft 3 feet square, lined in fitted limestone, with iron staples forming a descent of 8 feet, to a floor she could not see. She held the lamp over the opening. The air that rose was cold, dry, still, mineral, ancient, faintly metallic. The smell of a place sealed so long, it had made its own atmosphere, its own climate, its own preserved version of a moment the rest of the world had long since passed. She went upstairs. She ate, she slept or tried to. In the morning she descended. The staples held. She went down into the shaft with the lamp hooked to her wrist and stepped off the last staple onto the floor of a vaulted chamber. Not a cellar, not a cave, but something that preceded both. Carved from the living limestone, extended by human hands, then closed and forgotten. She held the lamp up and turned slowly. The chamber was long, running back into the escarpment beyond what the gatehouse footprint suggested, curving slightly right where the rock allowed. The ceiling was Romanesque, round-headed arches of cut stone, set without mortar, each piece fitted to its neighbor with a precision that had held for centuries. Along the walls, on shelves carved directly from the rock, were objects. She did not touch the documents that first morning. She returned the next day with 3 lamp wicks, a quart of oil, and a magnifying glass from the Threshwick stationers, entered precisely in the receipt book as a necessary expense. She began at the beginning of the shelf and worked along it with the methodical attention her father had taught her to give any inventory. The objects numbered 19. 11 were silver, not the grey tarnish she had seen at first glance, but silver of an age and quality the tarnish had only superficially obscured. When she rubbed the nearest with a fold of her skirt, the metal came up bright and unmistakable. They were ecclesiastical, chalices, patens, a ciborium whose lid bore an engraved vine of organic complexity, a processional cross dismantled for storage and laid in parallel sections like a body, a pair of candlesticks in a form she recognized from her father's architectural books as predating the 16th century, a small monstrance, its crystal lunette clouded but intact. The documents were wrapped in oilskin, heavy, yellowed to old bone, but intact. She unwrapped the nearest and found a roll of vellum, tied with a cord gone brittle but unbroken, sealed with wax that had cracked but remained legible. She held the magnifying glass to the seal, a falcon stooping, wings folded back in the attitude of a strike, and around it the words Hargrove, DEI, Gra. She unrolled the vellum and held both lamps at its edges to weight it flat. The document was in Latin, medieval Latin, abbreviated and contracted. Agnes had enough. Her father had insisted on it, holding that a woman who could not read Latin could be deceived by any clerk who chose to abuse the language's opacity. She read it slowly. It took the better part of an hour. When she had finished, she sat back on her heels on the stone floor and looked at the magnifying glass in her hand. It was a grant of land, dated 1247, in the reign of Henry III, from the Crown's own chancery to one Ralph de Hargrove, knight in consideration of service in the Welsh marches. The grant was absolute, fee simple, not fee tail, not conditional on male succession, passing to heirs general rather than heirs male. To anyone descended from Ralph de Hargrove, male or female alike, without the restriction of the male, entail that had governed the estate for the centuries since. She had found the original charter of the Hargrove estate. The second document was in English, the early 17th century's crabbed, orthographically inventive hand, dated 1643. A deed of conveyance from Thomas Hargrove, described as fearing parliamentary sequestration, to Josiah Thorpe, yeoman, described as a trusty friend, of the undercroft beneath the gatehouse and its contents, held in trust until the Hargrove family could reclaim them, for a nominal consideration of 1 shilling. Agnes read it twice. Then she understood. The Civil War. Thomas Hargrove, Royalist, Catholic, doubly vulnerable, had moved the most valuable and legally irreplaceable things he possessed down into this undercroft and conveyed them in trust to his neighbor. Then he had died. She had always suspected something of the kind, and the knowledge had passed out of the Hargrove family entirely, carried in Thorpe records until his great-grandson in 1791 sold the gatehouse to the new Colonel Hargrove with a deed that carefully excluded the undercroft, because the undercroft was not his to sell. The third document was the separate instrument mentioned in the 1791 deed, the one not herein contained. A conveyance from Thorpe to Hargrove, dated 1791, transferring the undercroft and its contents to the owner of the gatehouse, not the owner of the estate, the owner of the little limestone building at the foot of the drive. Agnes set the document on the floor and pressed both palms flat on the cold stone beside it and breathed, the silver on the shelves. 3 centuries of ecclesiastical plate, now belonging, legally, absolutely, by a chain of title she could follow document by document from 1247 to this moment, to the woman crouching on the undercroft floor in a dress that needed mending with £14 in a writing case upstairs. She reread the documents twice more. She made notes in the receipt book, listed the silver objects, wrote the chain of title in plain numbered English. Then she climbed back up the staples, lowered the trap door, and went upstairs and made tea. She did not go to a solicitor immediately. She went first to the church the following Sunday, and after the service asked the vicar, Mr. Aldous Crane, 60 years in the parish, a man whose knowledge of local history had accumulated like sediment, whether he knew anything of the Hargrove family's medieval past. He was delighted to talk. He told her about Ralph de Hargrove's crown grant. He told her of the family chapel, long demolished, on the escarpment above the valley. He told her, lowering his voice slightly, that local tradition held the Hargroves had hidden the chapel's contents during the Civil War and never recovered them, believed by some to be the origin of the family's later difficulties. He told her there was a burial entry in the parish register for 1643, Thomas Hargrove, died of fever July, which explained, Agnes thought, rather a great deal. The following week she went to Leeds, to a solicitor named Mr. Fairweather, recommended by Mrs. Denby at the mill as a man of scrupulous honesty. She brought the deed copy and a transcript of the 3 Undercroft documents with her Latin notes. She did not bring the originals, which she had replaced in their oilskin on the stone shelf. Mr. Fairweather read the transcript in silence, asked 3 questions: the condition of the documents, the nature of the 1247 seal, the precise wording of the 1791 exclusion clause, and then sat for a long moment with his hands flat on his desk. If the documents were what her transcript represented, he said carefully, the position was legally extraordinary but not ambiguous. The undercroft and its contents had been conveyed to the gatehouse owner in 1791, and the owner of the gatehouse was Agnes Hargrove. The silver was hers. As for the 1247 charter, that raised a question of considerably greater complexity about the estate title itself, which he would need to examine before advising further. Agnes said she would like him to examine it carefully. She paid his fee and took the train back to Threshwick. She told Gerald Hargrove nothing. A thing communicated before it is established is a thing halved. She waited and continued her repairs. She planted a kitchen garden, because a woman who meant to stay put seeds in the ground. She met her neighbors, Mrs. Denby at the mill, Mr. Suddart the blacksmith, and Miss Eliza Price, the new schoolteacher, 22, and visibly struggling with the loneliness of a new place. Agnes invited Miss Price to dinner twice a week, because she knew the specific texture of that loneliness. Mr. Fairweather's letter came 6 weeks later. 4 pages, dense. He had compared the 1247 grant against the current estate title. The original was in fee simple absolute, unrestricted by gender or inheritance form. The estate's current title rested on a deed of entail from 1682, converting it to male descent only. The question was whether that 1682 entail had been validly executed, given that the 1247 grant prohibited such restriction without Crown consent. There had been no such consent. The entail was, in his opinion, and that of a barrister colleague, voidable, perhaps void. If challenged, the estate would revert to the 1247 terms. Heirs general. Agnes Hargrove was Edmund Hargrove's widow. Under the original charter, she was a valid heir. She put the letter down and looked out at the drive and the avenue of beeches, climbing toward the hall. She had not sought any of this. She had come with £14 and the habit of reading documents, and she had read them, and what she had found was not justice in the simple sense, not the reversal of her losses, but something more durable. The floor beneath the floor, the thing that had been there before the wrong was done, and was solid. She wrote to Mr. Fairweather the next morning. She instructed him to proceed. The subsequent events unfolded over 8 months. Gerald Hargrove retained 2 solicitors in succession, and each was obliged, eventually, to concede the same points. The silver was not contested. The title chain was too clean. A specialist in ecclesiastical antiquities in York valued the pre-Reformation plate at a figure representing, as Agnes calculated from the estate accounts she had spent 11 years reading, approximately 40 years of the estate's annual income. A medievalist from the University of Leeds, whose hands shook slightly when he handled the 1247 charter, told her it was the finest surviving example of a Henrician crown grant he had encountered in 30 years of scholarship. The estate title settled in negotiation. Agnes did not seek the whole estate. She was not vindictive, or rather, she understood that vindication and vengeance were not the same thing, and that what she had found gave her the power to choose between them. She took a legal interest in the North Farm and its rents, unencumbered for her lifetime, a sum in the funds sufficient to maintain the Gatehouse for 20 years, and the undercroft, with its contents, in perpetuity, free from any claim by the estate. She wrote one letter to Gerald and Harriet Hargrove. Brief, formal, exactly what needed to be said. She thanked them for their generosity in the settlement. She wished them well. She did not mention the silver or the charter. She sent the letter by the morning post and did not revisit its contents. She received no reply. By the following autumn, the Gatehouse had ceased to be a humiliation and become something else entirely. She had rebuilt the east chimney with the mason's nephew, 3 days of good work in late August. It drew clean through the autumn. She had replaced the bedroom's rotten boards in proper oak. She had lime-washed the parlor and kitchen in a warm off-white that October light made nearly golden. She had furnished the parlor with a small library, books. She had been composing a list of in her head for 11 years, in a plain oak case fitted exactly to the alcove by the fireplace. The kitchen garden exceeded her expectations. The soil behind the outbuilding, sheltered by the escarpment, was deep and dark and generously fed by the same limestone-filtered water the pump drew from below. Mrs. Denby asked for lavender cuttings and sent a wheel of hard cheese in exchange, and from this transaction a friendship developed with the warmth that friendships built on useful exchange always have. The best kind, because they ask nothing of sentiment that sentiment cannot reliably provide. Miss Price came to dinner Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thursday evenings they read to each other, Miss Price a history of the Roman occupation, Agnes a manual of agricultural chemistry, and the evenings were varied and sometimes, without either of them planning it, very funny. Agnes walked the estate drive to church on Sundays without hesitation, which was a small act of self-possession she was conscious of without making much of it. By December, she was a person of the village in a way that needed no announcement, assembled from ordinary presents over ordinary months. The undercroft she kept. She had the mechanism cleaned and re-oiled, the staples checked and reset. A mason from Harrogate, recommended by the Leeds, medievalist, descended and spent 2 hours examining the vaulting, and came back up with the expression of a man who has just seen something he expected only to read about. The structure was sound, he told her. The vault had been built by someone who understood compression in stone with a thoroughness the centuries had since vindicated. Without intervention, it could last another 500 years. Agnes thanked him and descended that evening herself with 2 lamps. She had replaced the silver on the shelves. She had not sold it, though the York valuation sat filed in the rosewood writing case. The objects were hers in a way that went past legal title into something harder to name. They had been placed here by a man in fear, the last act of preservation before his world collapsed, held in trust for 150 years by yeomen who honored an obligation they had no reason to keep, then transferred with scrupulous care to the rightful line. And they had waited, in cold and dark and still air, for someone to come down the iron staples with a lamp. She had come down with a lamp. It seemed only right to be in no hurry to disperse what had waited so long. She held the lamp to the chalice she had unwrapped first, the wide-mouthed silver cup with 2 handles, its maker's stamp now identified by the medievalist as the mark of a York silversmith working in the 1370s, a man whose work appeared in 4 significant collections in England. The cup was 500 years old. It had been used, then placed in the darkness, and it had waited. She thought of Thomas Hargrove descending these same steps in the summer of 1643. Parliamentary troops not yet at the valley, but close enough to hear. She imagined the distant drum of horses on the road, carrying these things carefully, placing them with the attention of a man who believed in order as a form of hope, writing the trust deed with Josiah Thorpe, sealing the chamber, climbing back up the shaft and lowering the trap door, and then dying of a fever in July before any of it could be recovered. He had not known that she would come. He could not have imagined her, a woman of the 19th century, in a dress that needed mending, with a pry bar and a magnifying glass, and a copy of a conveyancing deed made in the evenings while her husband slept. But he had placed these things in the ground with care that assumed someone would eventually be patient enough, attentive enough, and undeceived enough by surfaces to find them. He had believed in some form in her, in the existence of such a person. She set the cup back on its shelf. Above her, at the top of the staples, the parlor lamp burned in the window. Its light fell across the kitchen garden, across the drive where the beeches stood bare against the pale December sky, and above the beeches, at the top of the hill, the hall sat with its lit windows and its 3 centuries of assumption, and it looked from this angle no larger than it was. Agnes climbed the iron staples. She lowered the trapdoor. She went upstairs and banked the fire and sat for a while with the receipt book open before her, the accounts running in their steady columns, every balance accurate, every entry in ink, because her father had taught her that a thing written in pencil could be changed, and a thing written in ink could not. The gatehouse was quiet around her. Not the silence of vacancy. This was the silence of a place restored to its own nature. Stone, warmth, the slow breath of a well-maintained fire, the sound of someone living inside it who knew what it was worth. She was 26. She had £14 and a deed the family had laughed at. She closed the receipt book and put out the lamp. And in the dark, in the warm, in the house that was entirely hers, she thought of a man placing a silver cup on a stone shelf in the summer of 1643, and of the particular quality of faith required to believe that what you have placed in the ground with care will one day be found by someone who deserves to hold it. She thought he would have understood her, and she thought she would have understood him, and that between them, across 3 centuries, sealed stone, an iron ring and a lamp, there was something that functioned, quietly and exactly like a conversation.